Good day, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us. Back by popular demand, this is a subsequent conversation with Dr. Sylvia Earle and her daughter Liz Taylor. We're going to dive right into the conversation here, and this is an interactive, I should say, conversation with you folks here today. So, just some quick instructions about how you can interact. Locate the Q&A panel down below. Feel free to submit your questions there. We'll do our best to address as many questions as possible when we get to our Q&A portion. And also during that Q&A, we'll give an opportunity for you to ask your question live. So if you have a question that you've been just dying to ask, please feel free to raise your hand during that Q&A portion at the end of today's webinar. Like I said, we're going to dive right in. So let's turn it over to Dr. Sylvia Earle and Liz Taylor. Go ahead.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Sylvia and I are continuing to shelter in place so that we're not having to go out and wear our ocean-themed masks.
Oh, these are so cool, though.
They really are.
Your friend
Jamie made these. So if you're going out shopping, mask up. And
this one has plankton and sargassum on it. I've even seen one with rhinestones.
Oh no.
Sort of the fashion statement in masks.
Yeah.
Not to take lightly something of really serious consequences, but you know, get with it. This is a piece of attire and make the most of it.
Yeah, it really is important. And, you know, especially right now, so many of us are really feeling like, what can we do? And we had so many questions last week that we really wanted to take another opportunity to come back and look at some of the bigger overarching themes that came through from all the listeners, and really understanding what are the consequences of the choices that we're making about the food that we eat, the things that we do, and how can each of us help through our behaviors in our daily lives and through education and becoming aware of what's going on, and just not falling back into complacency as things as we continue to flatten the curve.
The biggest pandemic is complacency.
It truly is. It truly is. So I just kind of wanted to dive in as well about this current BBC report that came out about saying that the oceans can be restored by 2050. What do you think?
We can never go back to what was 100,000 years ago or even 10 minutes ago, but we can make things better than they otherwise would be if we continue with the same behavior, the same complacency that we are now showing on a global scale. One of the most important things, maybe top of the list of what individuals can do, and it doesn't matter who you are or even how much you currently know or think you know, that is to try your best to get up to speed with the current state of what is out there to be taken in about the state of the ocean, with a particular focus right now on the microbes, on the little guys, on bacteria, on viruses. When I was a student many years ago, I was taken by a book by Claude Zobel. He was at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. He was an expert on marine microbes long before people even thought about microbes as a significant part of the global ecosystem. That's in the 1950s. Now we know that microbes outnumber everything else. We didn't know not so long ago about how important they are to our health. We need bacteria, not just for the oxygen they generate and the carbon they capture in the ocean, or their role in the roots of plants in the soil as a part of the natural, healthy, integrated system of life. But we also need viruses. Viruses are the source of great misery for humans, but they outnumber bacteria on the order of about 10 to 1. And here's the thing. Again, the knowledge is there. Go seek it out. I'm not the big expert. I listen to the experts. I try to, as a scientist, to learn things, discover things find out new things and then report what I see, but I also am attentive to what others are learning. That's how humankind has progressed from the beginning of our existence to the present time. Somebody learns something, they pass it along, they share the view. That knowledge is out there. It's not in our policies, unfortunately, right now. Somehow we have a country right now that is governed with an inadequate respect for science. It doesn't mean that the people of this country or the world have to have an inadequate respect for science. The knowledge is truly there. So, Claude Zobel, he was a pioneer. Another pioneer was the individual at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, Holger Janisch, who had a really great understanding before most could see it about how important microbes are to the chemistry of the planet as a whole. And it isn't just carbon capture and oxygen generation, because only a subset of bacteria can do that. The Prochlorococcus, and other cellular organisms in phytoplankton, as well as the green things on the land that do the heavy lifting, oxygen production, carbon capture. But the food chains, the nutrient cycles in the ocean, we're just beginning to appreciate how important viruses and bacteria are with respect to releasing the basic chemicals necessary, like fertilizer, if you will, the phosphates, the nitrates that power phytoplankton. And in the soil, similarly, viruses have a role to release what is in bacteria and other organisms. Here's the thing, again, I kind of take it for granted because I, as a scientist, have learned these. I didn't discover it, I learned it by listening to others. Viruses cannot reproduce unless they have a host. They can sit around in a latent form, sometimes not just for hours or days, but in the ocean, they can be latent, and bacteria can also, for long periods of time, maybe even centuries, maybe more, until they have the host that enables them to reproduce. They're able to enter the cells of bacteria or the cells of other organisms. And typically, they're pretty host specific, viruses are. That, we don't get the same viruses that except when they morph and go as they have in the case of the COVID-19 virus, that it transitioned from one species to us. Here's the other thing that we should be aware of, that, okay, one of the most troublesome viruses to humankind in all of history was smallpox. Check out Larry Brilliant's brilliant TED Talk. He got the TED Prize in 2006 for his wish to stop pandemics. Well, smallpox as a pandemic, compared to what we're seeing today, was a slow mover. Over 12,000 years, it grew from one population, transmitted to another. With humans, we are the host. We are the host for the smallpox virus that enables it to reproduce. And then we spread it to other hosts and so on and so on. When you think historically, what a huge impact that virus had on our civilization. No one, like today, no one is immune. We are just a host. And now we are not just isolated in populations in Northern Europe that bring them to North America so that the Native Americans contracted smallpox, and then Europeans with the virus transmitted it to Hawaii and just swept through the population that had no natural defense. And similarly, we are seeing now this that we're just a host. They don't care who
Viruses
you
don't
are.
care, no.
They don't know how important all of your history, what you've learned, your capabilities. They don't know about people who play music, or all they care about is, you're a host for me, and in they come.
Well,
And the fact that we are now connected, unlike 12,000, 10,000, even 1,000, even 500 years ago, now we have the means of, it's like a monoculture of humans all over the world,
right.
connected in not just, I mean, the good news is we're connected the way we're connected here right now. We're talking knowledge. We've got 7 billion brains that could be connected one way or the other, but our bodies are vulnerable.
They are, and I think a lot of it is as well that, when we have a natural system that's fairly intact, and we're not sort of actively blowing holes in these systems that really support us, as we've been doing really largely over the last 4.5 decades, that we have a much better chance of keeping these things in check or not having them really overwhelm us, and the viruses just kind of do what they do, and they are fairly benign for the most part. But when the whole system is kind of fragmented and stressed as it is today, these natural systems are so stressed.
Well, the way we have, not just in the wildlife markets, but with the way that we raise the animals that we consume,
Factory farming.
Farming.
Yeah.
I mean, it's seemed like such a good idea at the time, because you can create a lot of something that feeds a lot of people. But now that we know what we know, we can do better. That's the great thing. We learn, we pass that knowledge along. But we've really got to hurry. The knowledge about the risk of diseases being unleashed because we are destroying rainforests, because we're doing to the ocean what we're doing to the ocean through what we're taking out, through what we're putting in, disrupting the chemistry of the planet. We're setting ourselves up in a way that this is likely just the beginning, unless we really shape up fast.
Right. I mean, the human health and planetary health are just,
Totally.
like this.
Yeah.
They're locked in together, and when we start kind of systematically, intentionally tearing these things apart, it's not.
So imagine if everyone, starting those who are listening, but it seems like the human intelligent thing to do, get up to speed on what we know about viruses. It turns out what we don't know far exceeds what we do know.
Mm-hmm.
We thought they were rare once upon a time. Now, and an assessment of what's just in the ocean, we came up with a few hundred, then a few thousand. Most recently, in 2019, an assessment came up with a specific number that we know about of 200,000 variations on the theme of viruses that we know about. But it's just scratching the surface, like literally. Wherever there are bacteria, there are viruses that feed upon the bacteria. And this is an important part of the natural biogeochemical cycling of the nutrients that make life possible. The viruses invade bacteria, and they become so abundant that the bacteria burst and distribute their ingredients back into the system. So it sounds a little awful, but it's just the reality. It's the part of how the natural systems function. Whether it's a bacterium who dies because of a viral infection, or because a squirrel dies because it has eaten a bad acorn or whatever, the nutrients ultimately get back into the system. And so this is something that we should embrace with a sense of openness and, oh, now I understand. I wonder if viruses might be harnessed to help us now that we know how they operate. I mean, I can just see the kids out there with their fertile minds, wheels turning. They should be thinking, okay, what do I want to do? How can I make a difference? Think about how they can use their clever insights, their energy toward understanding how the world works and where they might be able to make a difference about the interrelationships with viruses and bacteria and phytoplankton, the zooplankton, sharks, you name it, we're all connected. How many viruses do you suppose are inside of a shark or in a teaspoonful of seawater?
Well, we've seen these recent, just in the news, just in today's news, talking about some of the, um, how many trillions of viruses there are in any given volume of water.
Like a mouthful.
Like a mouthful, right? And then, some of these other reports, one of the questions from last week had to do about how some of the microbes that were found in hydrothermal vents, the enzymes derived from those microbes and so forth, were actually being used in some of the promising treatments. And
it was actually in Yellowstone. It was the
that was the original, the original. I mean, and that was some years ago. In a hydrothermal vent, geothermal vent in Yellowstone.
Right.
But in the deep sea, where we're seeing some of these other vent communities, and the really unique bacteria and viruses and so forth that live in conjunction with those very harsh environments.
Harsh
for us.
But for them, it's
for them, they're
sweet
like,
home.
yeah, it's wonderful. Thank you. Yeah. Warm water. So, but that, it's one of those things where, again, just trying to understand the relationships between these things that are very small and to us largely ignored until they, reach out and touch us like they are right now.
We used to think of microbes. We didn't call them that. We called them germs.
Germs.
Bacteria, and they all bad. Now we know the great majority are really vital to our existence. We can't live without them. They help with the digestion of food, processing the chemicals in our body. They are our defense system. They are, absolutely vital to not just humans, but to every living thing. All of us, individually as well as collectively, we should think of ourselves as connected as ecosystem Earth. You are an ecosystem different from mine, different from everybody else who's out there.
Right.
7 billion human individual ecosystems, but we are all connected, and we're all just a host for certain viruses.
Right. One of the other questions from last week was, how do you really begin to explain and show how clear the connection is between unhealthy systems and the pandemic that we're suffering from right now? How does this sort of fraying of the fabric, this tattering that's gone on? I mean, it's gone on for a long time, really accelerating over time as our numbers have grown. But, people in general have a very short attention span and a short memory. So how do we really get people that aren't scientists to understand how clear this connection is and what we can do about it?
Well, I think there's this precious attitude about scientists are over here somewhere and here are the rest of humans. Look, everyone has the capacity to do basically what scientists do. You ask questions, you look for answers. If you can't find them through your own work, you go to your colleagues, to others who are looking for answers. And together, we come up with this enhanced knowledge of who we are, where we've come from, where we might be going, and how do we get from here to a better place. So I despair sometimes of people who say, who don't understand basically what science is. Science is discovering the nature of the world. Anybody can do it. Everybody should do it. And you may not be the one who makes a unique discovery, but you can be tuned in and be like a sponge, like children naturally are this way. They want to know everything about everything.
Curious.
Why don't you want to continue to
so
do
curious,
that? Yeah. So the essence of science should be just so basic. We learn language, we learn numbers, we learn music. Science is just the knowledge of the world around us, and it should be just integral to who we are. And okay, so some people make it their lifetime focus. I am a scientist. I'm because I've made it my business as a profession. But I, I look at you, you have had training in science. You don't call yourself a scientist, but you're science savvy.
Mm-hmm.
And you're always asking questions. You're always adding to your database. And as you learn new things, you change based on what you now know. And anybody can do this. Everybody should do this. What are we waiting for? We get locked into habits and we get to think, oh, this is the way it's always been, so that's the way it will always be. Huh. No, I've changed my eating habits
Yeah.
now that I know what I know.
Right. And you know, and food has become a big part of this whole discussion. I mean, seeing right from the heart of where um, COVID-19 seems to have sprung from by sort of mashing up wild animals that would have never naturally, normally been in
Been in
contact with
contact.
one
And the
another.
viruses have a chance to leap from one to another.
Right. So
And
they're an
ultimately,
opportunistic little critter, you know, so
yeah.
they're going to go,
And
you know.
especially stressed
And
animals.
stressed animals,
Yeah.
yeah. And so, you know, these choices that we make are not only good, better for our health, just if a person's going to consume animals, but thinking about, you know, things about transporting the food and the whole relationship with food is extraordinarily important.
Yeah.
It can make a huge difference.
And back to the question about the disrupted ecosystems
Yeah.
and wildlife.
And explaining that.
And explaining that, what I'm suggesting is go dive into what we now know about this, that the internet is rich with disinformation and misinformation, but it also has the real solid look at the source, you know, science, nature, the Smithsonian Institution, National Geographic. These are reliable sources. Information you get from Scripps Institution, from Woods Hole, from Plymouth Laboratories, from US Geological Survey. You know, they're not always right because we don't know everything that we need to know, but if you just use your, what is that thing called common sense? Anyway, the
things that are
judgment
yeah.
that comes with experience, that you can become knowledgeable and I'd love to, the person who answered that question, and I'd love to see what kind of solution they would come back with once they do their digging in to find out. But I think you've provided some of the response to that, with a disrupted system where animals are stressed and we put ourselves in association with them. And instead of looking at these intact, harmonious systems where if a bat gets sick in nature, it usually gets consumed pretty quickly, or any other creature. It doesn't have the opportunity to create pandemonium, if you will, a
Right.
disease spread among its own kind, let alone, although we see now that we are the vectors of creating diseases in other animals. Look at what we've done with salmon farming and introducing parasites that not only attack the salmon that are in cultivation, but because you have a monoculture of salmon, you get a lot of these parasites that then escape out into the wild. And normally that wouldn't happen.
Right. Yeah, the last time we talked about that problem with the introduction of lionfish to areas where they don't necessarily normally live, but it's just, again, these human vectors.
We created the circumstance by clear cutting the big fish away. The lionfish had a chance to get started.
Right.
A healthy, intact system doesn't very readily accept newcomers.
No, and again, it's a systematic fragmentation of these systems. It's one of the reasons that the areas like the hope spots and protected areas around the globe on the land and in the ocean are so important, because it gives these areas of kind of stability. And
connecting the dots, you can get a network of hope. And it's not just hope spots, it's what other organizations are doing all over the world, individual countries, individual organizations trying to work with communities. That's what we do with Mission Blue, but we need to energize people everywhere to do what they can, even in your backyard. I
Oh
mean,
yeah.
on the land as well as in the ocean.
Every yard by yard, you can make a difference. But one of the other listeners had asked about, is there a way to maybe ignite the United Nations in a way that's more unified, to bring some of these individual efforts that are going on all over the place, but to kind of bring them together in a way so that we can get better decision making before we sort of destroy a mangrove forest to put up a beachfront hotel, or to somehow get the environment and the value of these intact ecosystems into the greater balance sheet and on a global basis. Um, and then, wondering, another person's wondering, why do we always have to have a catastrophe before we do something? Why is it a catastrophe before we
It's
finally?
the 2x4.
Yeah, I mean, why does it take that to finally get us to sort of go, oh yeah,
Complacency.
exactly. So,
No.
but
Well, if the United Nations as an organization did not exist, and of course it hasn't always existed. I was 10 years old when it came into being, and the idea that it was 10 years old when I came into being. Anyway, the idea that we have to work together as humankind. We certainly respect individual property rights, if you will. That's our concept. Viruses don't care. We respect city borders, county borders, state borders, national borders. We're really good at creating borders and space that we put our stamp on. But when you look from afar, astronauts point out that you cannot see the walls, you can't see the boundaries. It all comes together. And mostly, the other thing they acknowledge is it's mostly blue, it's mostly ocean that connects us. It divides us, keeps us apart, but it also pulls us together. Understanding that there are common basic needs and things that as humankind we have to embrace. And we can do it, we should be able to figure out how to do it while continuing to respect nations, respecting cultures, respecting the individuality that sets us apart, while at the same time finding those ways to truly understand that we're all in this together.
mm-hmm.
And to your question, or the questioner's question about what can we do in a unified, in a universal way, not necessarily all doing the same thing, but all respecting the limits to what we can get away with and still have a planet that works in our favor. I mean, the headline for every human being: take care of the natural systems that keep you alive. I mean, it doesn't respect the biogeochemical cycles of life, don't respect where we have walls or borders or coastlines or whatever. It's just the facts of life. We have to respect the laws of nature, number one. We haven't been doing that.
Not very well, no.
And I think what the United Nations has the capacity to do is to inform and convey on a leveling field. These are the things that are for the common good. All humans need air to breathe, water that you can trust. We all benefit from the diversity of life. We all have a vested interest in protecting the diversity of life because that yields stability, which yields a healthy planet that we all need. And nothing else matters if we don't have a planet that works in our favor.
That's right. It's that fundamental connection between environmental health and human health. And for so long we've just kind of been cavalier about it, and
we think we're able to get away with whatever we want to do.
But no.
Now we know.
Yeah.
Well, now we do know.
We do know, yeah.
And I can forgive. Even though it pains me to forgive some of the stupid things that humans have done in the past in terms of eliminating passenger pigeons. We knew what we were doing. We were killing the last one, or the great auk. There's a certain pride in the individual who killed the last auk, because that would make the existing stuffed auks and remaining eggs that were in collections all that more valuable if there weren't any more except what they had already.
Yeah, I mean, and a lot of this problem does really sort of come down to that you know, the short-term gain,
Greed.
short-term greed versus the long-term prosperity.
And the common interest that we all share in having a civilization that endures with those things that we value about who we are, and that we want the future to be at least as good as what we presently have, because we have these little kids coming along, the continuity of humankind.
Yeah, yeah.
We want their future to have the potential for at least the kind of prosperity that we now have, if not better.
Yeah. And it's something that, you know, the listeners really seem to be asking for. You know, how can they make that difference? And, you know, particularly while people are in isolation, is it a good time to be kind of looking at the sustainability development goals, all the, you know, the SDGs? How can those be implemented in a more meaningful way, even as we get to a point where eventually the curve gets flattened? We try to figure out ways we can kind of get people back to work and this kind of thing. How do we keep the positive aspects going forward? You know, what can we do besides kind of recycling and taking public transit? You know, what can be done so that we don't just sort of forget and fall back into these complacent ways?
Well, recognize that the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG, were the aim for 2020, fulfilling these objectives. And now looking another 10 years ahead, what can we do by 2020? When those goals were formulated, the ocean was a subset of SDG 14, instead of it being like
number one.
could be. If we fail to take care of nature, nothing else really matters. It's an evolving awareness, starting many years ago, but really we got a real jump in awareness with that view of Earth from space toward the end of the 1960s. And then the 70s, a response to that, oh, this is it, the little blue speck in the vastness of space. This is all there is. We've got to take care of it. We're not doing a good job. And we got this whole series of environmental policies that, sadly, complacency, ignorance, greed, we're kind of slipping back into the time before we had that electricity go through us, to be aware we're vulnerable. We are vulnerable. Or maybe this virus is that electricity to cause us to realize that we have to respect nature, and we have to behave ourselves as, and recognize we're a part of nature, not apart from it, that we are creating the circumstances that make us vulnerable. And knowing that, we can take steps. Question you asked, that one of the listeners asked about, by 2050, can the ocean be restored? Well, we can make it a lot better than it now is. We can make the whole planet a lot better than it now, a lot safer, more secure, by respecting nature, by understanding that wildlife, that term, we think of nature as something to be used. First question many ask when something new is discovered, what good is it? What good is
exactly,
it?
Yeah.
As if you have to have an immediate product that you can make out of something that you've never seen before, as if and that determines whether it should live or die, whether it gets protected or not. Okay, so we've come out of that a little bit, that we respect creatures for whom we don't necessarily see an immediate purpose. Like, what good is a tiger? Well, some say, well, we need their bones from traditional medicine. We grind up the tiger bones, and some tigers are being raised just for that purpose. Not because we love the tigers or people love them, but because they just want to take the bones. And there's no evidence that there's anything to that perception. But anyway, but there are others who just respect tigers because they're majestic or they're beautiful, or because for intrinsic reasons we don't know how to make a tiger. Why should we take on the responsibility of eliminating tigers? Or we can look at it ecologically. We need tigers, or forests need, or the ecosystem needs tigers because they have a role in that. I mean, here's a list of potential, here's why we need tigers.
Answers, yeah.
Or if they went away, some ask, so what? Aren't there other things that can take their place? There is resilience in nature, but we shouldn't be the arbiters of who lives and who dies.
Right.
We don't know, looking at a computer system of the sort that we're using for this conversation, what are all those little pieces in there? Are any of them, can we take out some of them? This one doesn't look very helpful. It's just this tiny little piece. Let's take it out, see what happens.
See what happens, right?
This one or that one. And, pretty soon the image would go blank. It wouldn't take long.
Yeah,
Might even just take one piece.
That's right. You can pull the right one out, pull the plug.
But in nature, we've got 4.5 billion years of getting to where we are. And as you point out, it's like 4.5 decades
of just sort of like pooge, blowing holes in it, it's right and left. It's like, another question is, when it comes to the blue economy, why is it always focused on sort of mining and fishing? We're not
what
really
can we take out of the ocean?
What can we take from it?
Or the underutilized resources from the ocean.
Right. I mean, it's just kind of wild to think about that. I mean, people value the example of value,
what you can sell.
But talking about the food again, talking about the value of a tuna dead versus the value of a tuna alive, it's
or sea cucumber. Whoever thought that sea cucumbers would be stripped from a place because somebody liked to dry them and use them for medicinal properties, or grind them up and use them in soup. Again, what good are sea cucumbers? Well, some people have found a good for sea cucumbers in these various ways, but sea cucumbers have been around for 500 million years, more or less. It's only now that somebody has to decide whether they're useful or not.
I guess the same could be said for things like the horseshoe crab and, other animals that they look kind of strange and odd. We don't really understand what their role is, but we understand that we could extract them and sell them.
Cut them up for bait.
Or cut them up for bait. And so, we do, because it's that short-term gain. But like you say, now we know.
Or the microbes in the deep sea or in Yellowstone that have given us the ways and means of testing for the coronavirus that we're now suffering from.
Yeah. So I think it's, you've talked about it so much. Of course, E.O. Wilson has also talked about this, about protecting large areas on the land and in the sea.
Half the world, at least.
Half the world, just to really protect or create that enduring
respect for nature,
but really an enduring system, an enduring place for us as well. The more that we keep fragmenting things, the harder it is for us to prosper and to have an enduring future.
The idea that half of the world is high seas beyond national jurisdiction, back to the United Nations. What in a stroke could the United Nations do to, and just right now, have an insurance policy for humankind? Just back off the high seas. The industrial fishing that is taking place from a handful of nations, mostly 5 countries, are doing the heavy part of the fishing in the high seas. Part of the planet that until very recent decades, your 4.5 decade number, less than half a century, we have moved into the high seas. We couldn't do it before. We couldn't navigate. We didn't have the power, the fuel to go, or the means of refrigeration, or the means of getting ocean wildlife back to market. Before then, yes, whales were taken, and like the factory ships today that process ocean wildlife at sea, whether it's tuna or swordfish or squid or whatever, not necessarily processing them, but sometimes just freezing them or getting them back to marketplace soon enough while they're still freshly caught, that there is a market, a global market.
Right.
And again, these conduits for trouble, whether we're talking
absolutely
viruses or bacteria or these organisms that live in the wild, but they are taking up the toxins that we put into the air, that go into the ocean, that we put into the ocean directly, that come back through the food chain. I say I don't eat fish anymore. I've changed my food habits. I used to, but now I have respect for these creatures alive. I didn't know. Like, my family didn't know. We just did what people do. Seafood, as people then called it and still do, instead of looking at it as ocean wildlife, which
sea
is
life. Yeah.
Sea life. We just did what everybody else did. But once you know, you can't unknow. I can't look at a tuna that may have taken 20 years to grow and think that it's the most valuable thing that it can do with its life is to provide a salad or sushi or something for me. And now that I also know what it's been eating that I don't want in me, whether it's microplastics or nanoplastics or mercury or fire retardants or
anything
pesticides
else,
or herbicides.
Well, we didn't know about bioaccumulation really before.
Did not know.
No.
And when much of what we have now put into the ocean is coming back to us, it's coming out of the ocean in terms of things that we see. Oh, there's a shrimp cocktail, popcorn shrimp, or you name it. Well, yeah. Anyway, so my main reason for not eating animals anymore is that I see them. First of all, plenty of things, delicious things that can fuel me, and most of humankind. Most of calories that fuel humankind anyway come largely from plants or from plant-eating animals. When we turn to the sea as a source of food, we're taking carnivores, usually high-end carnivores. Carnivores like tuna, like swordfish, like halibut, like cod, that have eaten other fish, right on down the food chain and going the other direction, bioaccumulation, as you point out. We started out there with the bacteria and the phytoplankton and the zooplankton. It goes right on up manyfold into increasing in terms of the toxins. So these top predators that are the most,
the tastiest,
the ones that are most on our because most of the fish are carnivores. They eat other animals and other animals that eat other animals, and you get this accumulation. So even if I hadn't made the choice about leaving fish, now that I know them more personally and getting to understand that, like birds, I mean, yeah, I know bluebirds probably taste good. 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie. There's nursery rhymes about eating wild birds, but we don't tend to do that now. We know better. We respect birds because they're beautiful, because they're ecologically important. Why can't we respect fish because they're beautiful, because they're ecologically important, because they're fundamental to the biogeochemistry of the ocean and to the planet as a whole? The carbon link, the climate link, the chemistry link, of which we are all dependent, on which we're all dependent.
And, and we've seen examples of where people do have a greater respect for the fish, the Cabo Plumo, one of your hope spots, or the fish have really come back in the absence of heavy extractive fishing. The people still do take for their own family consumption a
Right.
little bit of fish.
They don't have that many choices as compared to people here in San Francisco or Oakland or
wherever,
New York or Chicago
large
or
city.
London
Yeah.
or most countries of big cities around the world get plenty of choices. We certainly don't need to eat wildlife.
No.
But coastal communities that have fewer choices and have long history of dependency, but if they just consume them locally, that would be one thing. What has perverted and corrupted these local fishing communities is the outside market.
Right. And that's where, something like we talked about, some of the choices that people have, they can choose to eat things that are grown locally or that they grow themselves. We're seeing this huge influx of, sort of this wild, the same way that people have been buying toilet paper, madness, they've been buying baby chicks, which is kind of wrong, but they're all thinking that they're going to raise their own eggs, and we're seeing a lot of people putting in, vegetable gardens,
Yeah.
sometimes for the first
The
time.
victory gardens of
Modern day victory
1940s,
gardens,
yeah.
right? And
I love that.
which is wonderful, but it really does go back to the fact about, when you think about food security, you have to think about environmental security as part of it, and not just sort of how we can move, peaches in the wintertime to New York from Australia, or vice versa. You really have to look at the whole
It's
footprint.
not food security, that's food choice.
Well, and it's really the
And
luxury.
it's okay.
It's luxury taste.
Yeah.
And it is okay, but it's really acknowledging it and
Right.
thinking about
Not subsidizing it.
not subsidizing it. Really,
We shouldn't be subsidizing food choice from the ocean.
No.
And we are huge. We should not be turning to the ocean with a belief that it is food security. In fact, it's planetary insecurity, because we're breaking the links in the basic ocean carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the generation of oxygen, the capturing of carbon. When we take, as we now are, 100 million plus tons of wildlife out of the ocean, those links are broken, and they're often very specific. And when you take them away, you create those disrupted systems that are open for, again, disasters. Like, how is it that lionfish got introduced into the Caribbean? Well, we took away the sharks, we took away the grouper, we took away the snapper. We destroyed the integrity of the system and opened it up for newcomers who were adaptable, fast growing. They would eat anything. So where they naturally occur in the Pacific, they're not a problem.
No, you were kind of lucky to see one on a dive.
For sure. So it's when we create these disrupted systems that, okay, watch out.
Yeah.
We're begging for trouble.
It's really true. And I think a lot of people feel sort of, a little bit helpless, because we're seeing these sort of really wacky mandates coming down from our political leadership, like getting rid of EPA regulations, for example. It's just like,
or relax the rules that we have about fuel.
Yeah, the things of this sort. So I mean, it's kind of, what can we do
it's perverse, exactly the flip side of things.
Well, it's making us more insecure, really, but
we're taking the national parks and commercializing them.
Yeah, but what can we do? Because it seems frustrating to, like, write letters to Washington, right? You just feel like it's not, or to any kind of leadership, that it just falls on deaf ears. But what can we do to sort of get more traction and really drive that kind of change? I mean, obviously we've all got to go out and vote, but are there other things we can do community wise, just to?
Well, I see it happening. That part of what is inspiring is to see individuals stepping up. You say they're frustrated, but what can they do? They start something, they do something. Next week, there will be a program about plastics, and the ocean elders has really worked closely with the Plastics Pollution Coalition with Diane Cohen, who's going to be um, one of the two speakers. And nobody told her to do this. She just, I'm going to get out there and make a difference. And it takes off.
Yeah.
But no one is without power. That's the thing. If you wait for somebody else to tell you what to do, you might be waiting a long time, and you might just be sitting in grief.
Yeah.
But don't let that happen. Just look in the mirror, which is what I see happening now with kids and with grown-ups too. Associate, if you see an organization that's doing something that you think is moving in the right direction, get behind them. Give them the support that you individually have. And if it's not financial support, you've got time, you've got connections. You may be able to use your skill as a writer or with numbers or whatever it is. It's hard for me or for anyone to tell anyone else what they're good at. You know better than anybody else. It's focusing on that something and saying, this is what I really care about. And I love it that there are a lot of kids who really care about sharks.
Oh, I know. Isn't that great?
And they want to save sharks. And it's this in a time when, from when I was a kid, 90% of the big sharks, at least, and a lot of the little ones too, they're gone because of grown-ups who, in ignorance, greed, complacency, whatever it is, have treated sharks as an underutilized species, group of species. Yeah. And let's go get them. Let's turn them into something that we can sell. It's like, wait a minute, don't you understand? Just try to make a shark from scratch. The sharks have been around for hundreds of millions of years, and we don't know how to put them back once they're gone. And if you think there's no value to them, maybe you should ask a shark, well, what are people good for anyway? Turn it around.
Well, it is that real role of the larger predators that we seem to predominantly extract from the environment.
I know.
But they have a huge role in keeping the systems in balance and check, keeping
They
them
are
healthy.
loaded with viruses.
That's true.
Good ones.
Yeah.
And bacteria.
Right.
Benign ones. They're not out to get us. They're part of what makes the planet work.
Right. But until we start sort of, again, kind of mixing them all up together and kind of commingling these species that would never really interact with one another.
Someone asked on the 200 plus questions that you've been answering one way or the other, and we welcome more. Really,
yeah.
We want to know what you think, and we'll do our best to get back to you electronically and otherwise. But the idea of are there pandemics in the ocean?
That's one of them.
A pandemic means global. What animals, what organisms are global in their distribution? Because viruses require a host. They're somewhere between living and non-living, but in order to reproduce, well, one of the definitions of a creature of life is that it's an agent, an organism able to reproduce itself. Bacteria can do this. Amoeba can do it. Birds do it. Humans do it for sure. But viruses can't on their own. They have to invade a host. And usually it's pretty host specific. So a pandemic in the ocean, what are the creatures that are everywhere? Well, bacteria. There's certain variations on the theme of Prochlorococcus, for example, that oxygen producing, carbon capturing, blue-green bacterium with variations. They're not identical, just as humans are not identical. We have, fortunately, lots of variations on the theme, but we're basically all humans. And basically, Prochlorococcus may be an example of having viruses that invade them on a global scale, but it's not so that they all perish. Otherwise,
We'd be in real
we'd be in
trouble.
real trouble.
Real trouble, yeah.
But it's not, in fact, it's a common thing for viruses to invade bacteria, and when they die or when they burst, when the viruses cause the death of a bacterium, that releases the nutrients into the biogeochemical cycling. It's
Right.
the way the chemistry of the planet functions.
Right.
And um, so there are creatures, sperm whales, there are orcas. I don't know of an example that I can point to. I don't know that there are examples of big creatures that we have seen a wave that is universal. Certainly, there have been epidemics
Mm-hmm.
where a regional die-off of an organism takes place for driven by one vector or another. The seagrasses along the eastern seaboard of this country uh, really created, it was a relative of a slime mold, was able to invade Zostra, the eelgrass, and it devastated an ecosystem that little fish were dependent on, and
Right.
shrimp and lots of things. And of course, the fishermen who depended on the fish and the shrimp and other creatures that lived in the Zostra beds and the eelgrass beds. We recently saw an example in the Caribbean with the long spine sea urchin,
Oh, the diadema.
the
Yeah.
black spine
Mm-hmm.
sea urchin. Mysteriously, they just underwent this collapse. That was an epidemic, a regional thing. A pandemic is global, and we are susceptible now that we are not only on all continents, even Antarctica, even that we are susceptible.
And very mobile.
Right.
It's the mobility and connectivity.
We're connected.
Yeah.
That's right. In a way that is unprecedented. So as I say, smallpox, it took a long time for it to reach wherever humans were because we had to transport it. We did it by ships across great oceans that kept us safe from the invasion. Kept
At
us,
least it slowed the spreading. Yeah.
But inevitably, perhaps, but then here's the cause for hope. Now we know what we couldn't know before. We know viruses exist. We know bacteria exist. We know how important they are. They're not all bad. In fact, most of them are vital to our existence. It's not like the idea that all insects are bad. So let's nuke them with
DDT.
a whole host of deadly chemicals that are turned out not just bad for insects, but they're bad for
us.
Life, for us, for all living things, biocides, if you will. And now we are beginning to wake up and say, what happened to the butterflies? What happened to the bees? What happened to those systems we know have a vital role in our agriculture, in our sense of beauty and wonder, like butterflies and such, the birds. But what seemed like a good idea at the time has come back to haunt us with maybe we have to get it through our heads. Not all viruses are bad. I mean, they aren't. Most of them are part of the living systems that make Earth habitable for us.
Mm-hmm. So it's April. Oh,
Hi, Liz, Dr. We're coming toward the end of our time here, and I just wanted to make sure we're being conscious of everybody's time here today. We do have some hands up and plenty of questions that you've actually been answering as they've been coming through very well as well. What do you think? Can we maybe share the last couple slides with our attendees? And would you mind hanging out a couple minutes extra? Maybe we can take some questions from the audience.
That would be great. That
okay.
Really worked out well last time.
Thank you so much. Yeah. And that was a good ending point there for us, folks. Just for those of you who don't have more time to spend with us, we will be back again with Dr. Earle and other groups. Coming up on the next slide, we have an agenda for some future events. We want to thank you on behalf of Mission Blue and Ocean Elders. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. I want to point your attention to the chat tool. If you don't have the chat tool open yet, you'll see some information there and instructions. If you'd like to make a contribution to Mission Blue, your contributions go a long way to helping their organization to continue the work. So hang on, those of you that have your hands raised, and more hands are going up. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible. Technical support for today's event has been provided by the webinar. My name is Joshua. You can learn more about our work, and we're happy to donate time to this great cause. Check out thewebinard.com. Upcoming town halls are available, and here you can view the schedule, find us on social media, follow Ocean Elders to keep in touch and see those registration requests go out. And we look forward to quite a lot of great events, great guests coming up to explore really important topics for today. And with that, thank you, everybody. If you only had an hour to spare for us today, we understand, and you're welcome to disconnect anytime. We're going to stay on just a little bit over time to take some additional questions. So this is a nice treat. And, you know, a couple people have had their hands up for a while here. I'm going to start with Giselle. Giselle, I'll need you just to unmute yourself at the bottom left. Do you see the option to unmute? Go ahead. Giselle, I see
Hello.
that. Hi, we hear you. Go ahead.
Hi, doctors. I live in Argentina, and I want to know how can I do to help, because I'm in love of the sea since I was 3 years old, and I'm just a biology teacher, but I can give time, I can give my weight, my everything, but how can I be helpful to your projects?
I would suggest looking into the website Mission Blue and realize that Argentina is one of the critical countries for taking on protection of the ocean systems. We can answer or do our best to get back to you personally. Much depends on where your particular interest actually is. And maybe it's locally in your community, but maybe there are things that you can do to spread the word about the importance of taking care of what you have right there in your own country, and to start something that would be helpful just within your own circle, as well as to extend to the rest of the world beyond.
Get those kids out on more field trips too.
Yeah, no child left dry.
That's
Get
right.
kids out there. Oh, and maybe wearing these
For right now. Yeah.
But
virtual field trips maybe.
Yeah, we have an opportunity now that we're kind of closed in for a bit to really use this time to read those books that we haven't
surrounded by books.
been meaning to, that are loaded with inspiration and insight. It's an opportunity to draw on your own knowledge and to write and to do what you're doing, asking questions and seeking advice from those that you trust. So I appreciate your willingness to weigh in and ask the question, and we will try to get back to you with some concrete examples that are appropriate for you.
And I think even with, getting kids, even while they're sheltering in place at home, there's a lot of exploring that can still go on just in the backyard, around the house, the magnifying glass or a hand lens, or the magnifier on the phone. There's a lot of exploring that can be done to sort of, stimulate the curiosity and help to broaden the understanding of how interconnected systems are locally and then onto a global level.
Yeah, generally it's like in 2012, the United Nations got together and said, what is the future we want? What is the future we want? If all of us, each of us can say, okay, where do I want to be in 6 months, in 6 years, 10 years? And to make, you know, often we get so wrapped up with day to day to day to day, we forget we have to think about, where are we going to be? Where's my family going to be? Where are the things I care about going to be? We can look back and see what's happened in the recent past. Do we want more of that, or do we want to, can we learn from the past to make our future more like a better place, whatever that means?
That's great. Thank you so much, Giselle, for your question. Next, I think we'll go, oh gosh, it's so hard to decide. So many hands up. Tim, we're coming to you. Go ahead and unmute at the bottom left-hand corner. Tim, there you go, Tim. Go ahead and ask your question, please.
Wow, I'm flattered.
There you go, Tim.
Dr. Earle, I know it's been many years since you and I have spoken. I used to work for Cousteau back in the day, and I did an interview with you and a long dinner, several long dinners. But I did post some questions, and 2 questions. And as I've been listening to you talk, probably the second question is the one that's now burning, and that's the film that Jean-Michel did with NRDC a couple of years ago about sound pollution, noise pollution underwater, and how damaging it is to the marine mammals and other species, and how the sound travels hundreds and hundreds of miles and is doing collateral damage that we don't even know about. And I was wondering what kind of progress has been made on that front to try and mitigate that sound pollution. Are you aware of any?
First thing is to know that the problem exists, and we didn't think that was such a big deal. I mean, I think industry is becoming aware, thanks to efforts such as the film that you mentioned and the overall efforts. NRDC has been a leader, Natural Resources Defense Council, in terms of focusing public attention on the impacts, especially on marine mammals, but it's across the board. It's a factor in our environment. The plankton in the ocean is affected by noise. You'd say, well, what do you mean by that? Well, it's so intense at times that the little bodies of zooplankton can be literally shattered by the noise. It isn't just they avoid the sound or the sound waves or whatever, they're physically damaged in the process of these huge blasts of sound, whether it's in terms of geoprospecting or mapping or sonar to detect submarines, whatever it is. We did not know this could be a problem, but now that we know, it is having an impact that not nearly what we should be doing more, but ships in some cases are altering their pathways to avoid known areas where whales are congregate or have their migration patterns. It's a start, but if you don't know, you can't care. And there's a lot of not knowing, and there's a lot of not caring going on out there that we face with respect to this and a host of other environmental issues. But keep doing what you're doing in terms of getting the word out. It's the critical starting place, knowing what the issues are.
Right, and it's so important that we're having these conversations. It's such a great opportunity. Let's see if we can have one more person join this conversation. I'm looking at Ella. Ella, how are you doing? Go ahead and unmute at the bottom left and ask your question, please. Ella, there we go. You're
Hello.
unmuted. Hi, Ella, go ahead.
Hi, I was wondering, I think so many of us are really interested in doing more, just as previous people have said. But how can you do it on a bigger scale? especially the states that are on the interior of the United States. Because if you go to the coastal states, so many of those states are already involved in, helping with the environment. But I really think I'm from Michigan, and trying to discuss anything that's environmental seems to be so difficult. People just don't get how important the ocean is. And so with that said, I'm trying to do a charity so that I can raise finances for people that are working in the field like you. But what suggestions do you have, if any, that can get more people involved and to try to teach people and educate to them the magnitude of how important the environment is, and particularly the ocean?
Well, I sometimes start by saying to people who have never touched the ocean to realize that the ocean touches them with every breath they take, every drop of water they drink. And that calling card of that view of Earth from space, it's mostly a blue planet. And if people can be reminded, I mean, the knowledge may be lurking there somewhere in the deep, dark depths of their mind about where air comes from, where water comes from, how everything connects, that the systems that make our existence possible start with the presence of an ocean. No ocean, no life. I sometimes also suggest an image of Mars. No ocean, not very friendly. A planet that is, by our standards, fairly barren. Where we take away the ocean, you don't have trees. That sounds like, what? I don't understand. Well, where does water come from? Basically, 97% of Earth's water is ocean. So we might learn as kids in school about the water cycle, but often you see a diagram of water being transpired from trees going back up into the sky that falls back as rain. Well, okay, that's a piece of it, but most of it is ocean action. Water cycling from the ocean into clouds that falls back on the ocean, but also on the land. It's the ocean that drives climate. It's the ocean that drives weather. It's the ocean that regulates temperature. It's the ocean that governs planetary chemistry. It's like saying, I've never seen the ocean, so why should I care? Most people have never seen their heart either. Why should they care? Think of the ocean as the blue heart of the planet. It's what keeps us alive, no matter where you live on the planet. It's the ocean that you should thank every day because you exist. It's not what we take out of the ocean or using the ocean as a place to dump things we don't want. It's the fact that the ocean has shaped Earth into a habitable place in a universe that is really unfriendly. So I don't know what works with your friends and neighbors, but I know that knowing that it's the ocean that makes my existence possible is a good starting place.
Definitely. And the whole connection we have to water wherever we are.
Right.
And the whole
all flows to the sea.
It all flows to the sea. So even in the states that are landlocked, working with groups that are focused on local watersheds and protecting watersheds and rivers and things of that sort.
What you put on your lawn winds up in the Gulf of Mexico.
Right. It all flows downstream, but it can really help to support some of those groups and then see how they can be connected to one another, or to even to some of the hope spots, and to get a dialogue going. It seems
and ask them, are you eating halibut? Are you eating shrimp? Are you eating tuna? Give it a second thought. Doesn't mean maybe you have to stop eating it, but maybe give it a break.
Yeah.
Well, think about it anyway.
Exactly.
Liz, Dr. Earle, it's been such a pleasure again being able to assist you in this conversation. Um,
Thank you.
want to thank you and thank all of our audience again for your valuable time. And it's the importance of having these conversations. That's why we want to do this and bring these conversations out to you. And so thank you again to you, Liz and Dr. Earle, for taking the time to share your thoughts with us and answer the questions that
Wear
we
your
have
mask.
here. On behalf of Ocean Elders and your face masks and Mission Blue, we want to thank everybody so much for taking the time to join us once again today. We're going to wrap up today's session, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.